I'm Ann Lindsay, Assistant Professor of History at the University of Central Florida, and you are listening to the RICHES Documentary Podcast. Welcome to the RICHES Documentary Podcast. RICHES, the regional initiative for collecting the histories, experiences, and stories of Central Florida, is an umbrella program housing interdisciplinary public history projects that bring together different departments at the University of Central Florida with profit and nonprofit sectors of the community in order to promote the collection and preservation of the region's history. By facilitating research that records and presents the stories of communities, businesses, and institutions in Central Florida, RICHES seeks to provide the region with a deeper sense of its heritage. This series will feature a podcast every 2 weeks, in the middle and at the end of each month, that will explore various aspects of Central Florida history. In today's episode, Orlando, the story behind the name, we examine the intriguing theories surrounding the origins of Orlando's name by speaking with various historians and experts who have written about the subject, as well as a descendant of one of the area's first settlers.
Hello, you are listening to Orlando, the story behind the name. For decades now, numerous myths and theories have surrounded the naming of Orlando. And while certain of these have enjoyed various levels of acceptance, none have ever been proven. In this podcast, we will examine this intriguing element of local history by speaking with various historians and experts who have written on the subject. We will also speak with a descendant of one of the area's first settlers, and by comparing these different points of view, it is hoped that you, as a listener, can arrive at your own conclusions to determine which of these so-called myths are most credible. Perhaps the best place to begin is with a definition of myths in general. In his work, Mystic Chords of Memory, author Michael Kamen states the following: "A myth is more likely to be fabulous than true, more likely to involve some sort of story, and quite likely to concern heroes in order to explain aspects of a society's cosmology or sense of identity." He goes on to say that myths and legends flourish despite the accessible bodies of factual information that contradict them. These are words to keep in mind as we now attempt to unveil the multifaceted story behind the naming of Orlando. Perhaps the theory that is most widely celebrated is that of the supposed Seminole War hero Orlando Reeves. I recently had the opportunity to speak with local historian and journalist Joy Wallace Dickinson, and she had the following to say about this particular legend.
The story that Orlando was named for a Seminole War soldier named Orlando Reeves just will not go away. The city has continued to sort of enshrine it. I think there is a marker at this side of Lake Eola, at the east side, that was put up in the late 30s with money donated by school children or middle school children in the memory of Orlando Reeves. But there's also another marker at the other end of Lake Eola where this put up by the city, I think, that tells, at least mentions Orlando Reeves as the source of the name Orlando. The story supposedly is that in the 1830s, during the Second Seminole War, that a band of U.S. Army soldiers was camped at one of the lakes around here, either Lake Eola or another lake, and that stealthy Seminole warriors crept up on them, and that they were all killed, including, I guess, the brave sentry Orlando Reeves, and I think that he warned the others. But he did die, and he was buried, and there was a marker that marked his grave, and he was remembered for his great bravery.
Throughout the years, this legend has become a virtual mainstay in Orlando's local lore. The story, however, possesses a number of variations. When I asked local author Steve Raytar why so many exist, he expounded with the following.
It has a number of variations, largely because there's so many different places it could have happened. It could have happened by Lake Eola or Lake Ivanhoe or Lake Lawsona or a few other locations in town. And over the years, many so-called experts have come up with the definitive answer as to where it was. Unfortunately, they're in different places all over, so that there's no consensus.
Other variations of the story have dealt with the identity of Orlando Reeves himself. Elaborating on this aspect is the executive director of the Florida Historical Society, Dr. Benjamin Brotmarkle.
There was a newspaper account in 1884 that called the soldier Orlando Jennings instead of Orlando Reeves. So there's that slight variation on the story. The interesting thing is that if you go to the War Department records from the Second Seminole Indian War, it lists 1,466 soldiers who were killed during that conflict, and neither Orlando Reeves or Orlando Jennings appears on that list.
Given the fact that Orlando Reeves is missing from the historical source data, many historians have come to doubt his very existence.
I'm one of the people that think Orlando Reeves didn't exist, because I think people have done a lot of research that sort of shows no Orlando Reeves turns up in the Army rolls. There were not military movements near here during that time, that it doesn't make sense.
Nonetheless, his story has become firmly entrenched in Orlando's sense of historic identity. I was curious to find out from my interviewees why they felt this legend of Orlando Reeves has taken such root.
Well, it's one of those things where if you repeat something long enough and forcefully enough, then sometimes, unfortunately, it becomes historical fact, in quotes. You know, it ends up in history books, it ends up being repeated over and over time, and people just start believing things sometimes that aren't necessarily true.
Why do I think it had such longevity? I think people apparently have been telling the story for a long time. So I think that it really mirrors a lot of the kind of cowboy and Indian tales that were really popular in the first part of the 20th century. I mean, starting with Wild Bill's Wild West show that toured and even came to Orlando in 1912. And it seemed to me to have a lot of resonance of the kind of shoot-'em-up stories that really were inspired by Plains Indian warfare rather than the Seminoles.
In addition to the legend involving Orlando Reeves, there are also a number of other stories that have gained notoriety throughout the years.
One of the most popular legends involves a guy who was named Orlando, who supposedly operated an ox cart that went from the Tampa area to Fort Gatlin, bringing supplies to the soldiers. And supposedly on one of these trips, this man named Orlando died at Fort Gatlin, was buried there, and people would say, "There lies Orlando," and so his name stuck.
There's also a theory that John J. Worthington, who moved here in 1850, may have started the name. He built the first log house in the downtown area and also the town's first wood frame house, and he ran a store, and supposedly he nicknamed the area Water or Land because we've got so many lakes. And water or land, if you kind of slur that together, can be turned into Orlando. So maybe he came up with it.
Yet another popular story is that of Orlando Reese.
There was a man in the area, not specifically in Orlando, but in this general area in what was then Mosquito County in the 1830s, named Orlando Reese, R-E-E-S. That Orlando was a real planter who came in from South Carolina and had a good amount of land up around De Leon Springs, with slaves, like 90 slaves, and a pretty sizable plantation. Anyway, Mr. Reese did not die here. He returned to his home in South Carolina, and his descendants said that their family story had always been that Orlando, Florida was named for their ancestor, Orlando Reese. He was here during the Seminole Wars, and for whatever reason, perhaps Mr. Reese was in this area, and that maybe a marker was left that said Orlando Reese.
One thing that he did, or at least this is part of the legend, was as he went into an area and cleaned out the area or chased out the Indians from the area, he put up signs, and he put his name on the sign. And it is thought by some that one of those signs nailed to a tree right by Lake Eola was misinterpreted as not being a, "Hey guys, I've gotten the Indians out of this area," but to be his grave marker. So everybody assumed, oh, well, that must be where Orlando died.
Orlando Reese, although he wasn't in the military, was called Colonel. And he wrote to the government that he was having trouble with the Seminoles in 1837. But then when the 1840 census comes along, he's no longer living in that area. So Orlando Reese might have been confused with Orlando Reeves. So historians just aren't sure.
Again, we're talking about times in which there just were not very many people here. I mean, this was so early. So we're talking about, times when a big county had maybe a few hundred people. I think Mr. Orlando Reese from South Carolina had something to do with it, definitely.
Still more theories abound.
Another one involves a judge that came to the area named J.G. Spear, who came here in 1854, and he was very active in developing Orange County. He actually had the county seat moved from Enterprise to Orlando in 1856.
He was probably the most prominent person in the Orlando area, and we're pretty sure that Judge James G. Spear came up with the name.
At the meeting in which this area was given a post office and in which the settlement was named Orlando in 1856, the story goes that he got up and said, a lot of people have called this Orlando's grave, and why don't we name it Orlando, in part inspired by his admiration for Shakespeare.
In the Shakespeare comedy As You Like It, one of the main characters is named Orlando. Now, this would seem like pretty flimsy circumstantial evidence, but one thing that bolsters it is that one of the main roads that goes through downtown Orlando is Rosalind, and Rosalind is the female counterpart to Orlando in the play As You Like It.
We don't really have very much written documentation at all. We have recollections of people who remembered hearing from ancestors who were at that meeting or knew people who were at that meeting that Judge Spear was the one whose idea it was to name it Orlando.
I was able to sit with one of Judge Spear's descendants, his great-great-grandson Jack Ross. Jack, a native resident of Orange County, had himself heard the story through his mother, who had been informed by one of the area's earliest inhabitants, Mrs. Annie Tilden.
Yes, what I know about it was told by my mother, and she had Mrs. Tilden tell her way back, 60, 70 years ago, and she got it from Judge Spear, that he named it after a character in Shakespeare's As You Like It. I don't know why he picked that particular one out, but I guess maybe it sounded good to him or something.
Having now learned about the many different myths, I asked my interviewees whether they felt any of these stories were perhaps related or intertwined in some way.
Well, I think certainly the myths that we were talking about, or the legends that we were talking about with Orlando Reeves and Orlando Reese, there might have been some confusion there. Orlando Reeves being the soldier that was supposedly killed in 1835 at Fort Gatlin, and Colonel Reese, who wasn't really a colonel but lived near Fort Gatlin and did have documented trouble with Seminoles. It's possible that they were somehow mistaken for each other, or that those legends became intertwined, certainly.
Well, all of the ones that deal with the soldier have something in common, either where he was buried or how he was shot or what he did. The other ones that deal with Spear all have something to do with him. And then there's those who take the name after somebody else who lived here. Orlando Rees, Orlando Reed, Orlando something or other. I think that a lot of people who came afterwards just looked for anything. I mean, we could name it after Tony Orlando and Dawn, tie a yellow ribbon. Yeah, that must be it. But yeah, there is something that is related to more than one legend. Unfortunately, there's so many different variations, so many different tangents you can go off on, that you can't find a core one where it says, well, this must be where the other ones came from. It's just kind of a big net, and whichever direction you go, you just keep going.
At the conclusion of our interviews, my respondents chimed in on those theories they felt were most credible.
I tend to lean towards the J.G. Spear theory, having it being based on the play by Shakespeare. Although it's mostly circumstantial evidence, it certainly is strong circumstantial evidence. J.G. Spear was instrumental in developing Orlando, and it is documented that he was a fan of Shakespeare, and we have that Orlando and Rosalind, two characters from the same play. So I think that's likely. And the other theories are kind of shot down by the war records. And then again, the popular lore of the Mr. Orlando from Tampa who died is a popular story, but there's really nothing to back that up. So having a humanities background and just thinking that it's probably the best theory, I'll go with J.D. Spear as the most likely.
Yeah, I think that Judge Spear probably did suggest it. I think the subject for debate in the past was whether his motive was to name it strictly for the Shakespearean character, or whether he knew of the story of Orlando Reeves, or whether the whole thing about Orlando's grave was inspired by this Seminole War event.
We really don't know, probably never will know. If you talk to 5 experts, you're going to get 5, 6, maybe 10 different opinions as to what it might be. I have a feeling that it was Judge Spear who came up with the name, but I don't know if he ever actually explained why. Maybe he just thought it sounded good. Maybe he just thought it was romantic. Maybe, who knows what. But I have a feeling that we'll never know why it was named what it is, but we have a pretty good idea of who did it. Unfortunately, we can't ask him.
While we may never know the answer as to how Orlando derived its name, the mystery is one that is sure to keep history enthusiasts guessing as the years continue to unfold. We hope you have enjoyed this podcast, and that as a result you may have found a greater interest and appreciation for our area's truly unique historical roots. Thank you for listening.
Thank you for listening to the Riches Documentary Podcast. Feel free to contact us with any questions or comments on the program that you just heard. Please join us for the next episode, Hannibal Square, the other side of Winter Park, Florida.